Good morning and welcome to Breakfast with Roger Johnson and Victoria Fritz.
Hello, good morning. Our headlines today. Reflections after the day the Queen and the nation bid farewell to the Duke of Edinburgh.
One of the defining images, Her Majesty sitting alone as she said goodbye to her husband of 73 years.
The royal family will continue to grieve this week, although the period of national mourning has come to an end.
Also this morning, the melting of the world's biggest iceberg, once a quarter of the size of Wales.
Celebrating 70 years of Britain's first national park.
This is one of the most popular areas of the Peak District, but just imagine, before the national park was formed, you weren't allowed to walk across open moorland like this.
Good morning. No quadruple for Manchester City as Chelsea beat them in their FA Cup semi-final at Wembley.
Good morning. It's a dry and sunny day across England and Wales and a little warmer than yesterday. Further north, there's more in the way of cloud and some light patchy rain for Scotland and Northern Ireland. All the details coming up shortly.
Hello there, it's Sunday the 18th of April. Our top story. The royal family has honoured the Duke of Edinburgh's humour and humanity as he was laid to rest at St George's Chapel, Windsor. The service was restrained in line with the Duke's wishes and coronavirus guidelines.
The Queen sat alone just days before she turns 95. Princes William and Harry were seen chatting together as they left the service, and the royal family will continue to mourn the loss of Prince Philip this week, while the period of national mourning has come to an end.
Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell looks back on the funeral that was watched by millions of people around the world.
Drawn up in the spring sunshine on the castle's quadrangle were the military detachments. They stood with heads bowed and rifles reversed. The scale was smaller than would have been the case without the pandemic, though that's hardly something that would have troubled the Duke. He, after all, had choreographed much of what was to follow. The Land Rover hearse, which the Duke had helped to design, moved to its position by the state entrance. The Duke's coffin was borne on the shoulders of a bearer party from the Grenadier Guards. The coffin was covered with the Duke's personal standard and surmounted with his sword and naval cap and a wreath from the Queen. With great care, it was placed on the hearse. Behind the hearse were members of the royal family who were walking to the chapel, headed by the Prince of Wales. A royal salute sounded, and the first sight of the Queen, accompanied by a lady-in-waiting in the state Bentley, taking position as the order was given for the procession to step off. Close by was one of the horse-drawn carriages the Duke had taken such pleasure in driving. On the seat, his cap and gloves. Among the members of the family walking behind the coffin were Princes William and Harry, the focus of so much attention, walking with their cousin Peter Phillips between them. The procession wound its way past the castle's round tower. By the side entrance to St George's Chapel, other members of the royal family stood with their heads bowed. The Queen made her way into the chapel, pausing to look back as the hearse moved on down the hill. On the wreath of white roses and lilies on the coffin was a card, on which were the handwritten words, in loving memory. Before they entered the chapel, the bearer party paused as a field gun signalled the start of a 1-minute silence. The service began with a tribute to the Duke from the Dean of Windsor.
We have been inspired by his unwavering loyalty to our Queen, by his service to the nation and the Commonwealth, by his courage, fortitude and faith.
The small congregation sat in its family groups. The Queen sat alone. So did Prince Harry. After the prayers and the commendation, a distinctive touch typical of the Duke, Royal Marine buglers sounded the Royal Navy's call to action stations. And finally, at the end of her husband's funeral, the choir sang the national anthem. Seldom can its words have had greater poignancy. The family mourners departed, a widowed queen to her castle, and two brothers, William and Harry, walked away together alongside the Duchess of Cambridge. The Duke of Edinburgh is gone, but the brothers know that he would have wanted the family to move on and for differences to be healed. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
Well, our correspondent Helena Wilkinson is at Windsor for us. Helena, although of course the official mourning period is now over, this is still very much a time of reflection, isn't it, for many?
Yes, absolutely. And the royal family will continue to observe a further week's mourning. We expect the flags that were lowered to half-mast after the Duke died last Friday to be raised later on this morning. But here very much in Windsor, a day of reflection after what was a very intimate, private family funeral that was watched by millions across the world. And it was a funeral, as we've just heard, that had been planned by the Duke of Edinburgh over many years, from the Land Rover that he designed and modified to the songs that were sung in the chapel service yesterday. But the most striking image, of course, from yesterday, and the saddest of images, was the Queen herself in the chapel. Of course, over the last year, she had bubbled with her partner, her husband, Prince Philip, but yesterday she sat alone because of COVID restrictions in the chapel itself, and she looked onto the coffin and she said goodbye to her husband of 73 years. And last night, the royal family tweeted this very poignant picture of the Duke of Edinburgh after the funeral.
Thanks very much, Helena.
Now, more than 200,000 new COVID cases have been recorded in India for 3 days in a row, taking the total number to nearly 14.5 million.
Now, that makes it the world's second worst infected country behind the United States.
We're joined now by our South Asia correspondent, Rajini Vaidyanathan, who is in Delhi for us this morning. Rajini, thank you for joining us this morning. Huge numbers, which must be causing a good deal of concern.
Yeah, huge numbers. And actually, in the last half an hour or so, we got the latest figures for the last 24 hours. Another record increase. We keep saying that day after day here at the moment. More than 261,500 new cases and more than 1,500 deaths. And it is worth pointing out that some experts believe that the death toll and the case toll is actually far higher. We've seen in some parts of the country reporters counting the number of bodies in crematoriums and saying it just doesn't match with the figures that are officially being released. So it could be an even far higher toll. We are also hearing and seeing distressing scenes around the country, families trying to get their loved ones into hospitals, ambulances lining up outside, trying to get patients in. And on social media, lots of messages desperately being posted by people saying, have you got a bed? Have you got oxygen? Have you got medicine? It really does feel like a very dire situation here at the moment.
Rajini, thank you very much indeed.
Now, the two Russian men suspected of carrying out a poison attack in Salisbury in 2018 have now been linked to an explosion at an arms depot in the Czech Republic.
Yeah, the Czech authorities have issued pictures of Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Bashirov, who they say were in the country when the blast happened in 2014, leaving 2 people dead. A senior Russian parliamentarian has called the claim absurd.
Now, the time is 6:10 in the morning. I just want to tell you about this story. What was once the world's largest iceberg has finally broken apart. A68, as it was known, covered an area of nearly 2,300 square miles when it broke away from Antarctica in 2017.
Yeah, the satellite images now show that the megaberg has virtually gone. It's broken down into countless small fragments that the US National Ice Centre says are no longer worth tracking. Here's our science correspondent, Victoria Gill.
A 1 billion tonne block of ice. When iceberg A68 broke away from Antarctica back in 2017, it measured more than 2,300 square miles, a quarter the size of Wales. It was only by imaging it from space that scientists could actually follow the massive iceberg's journey as it inched its way north. At one point, it was on a direct collision course with the Antarctic island of South Georgia, potentially threatening to cut off vast populations of penguins and seals. But it was off that coast, in the open ocean swell, that the world's largest iceberg broke apart. And now that it's officially been declared deceased, the scientists who've been following its journey say they're surprised that it survived as long as it did.
So this thing is incredibly fragile and flexible as it moved around the oceans. It lasted for years like that as it moved around, but eventually broke into 4 or 5 pieces, and then those broke up again. But the end point for some of these fragments was quite interesting, because just very suddenly overnight, they just fragmented into millions of little tiny pieces. And you can see that on the satellite data. And that process, I think, is something that needs studying a little bit more, because it might tell us a little bit about how ice shelves will break up in the future.
A68, being the size of a small country, made it the focus of global media attention. But the breaking away or carving of these giant icebergs is a natural part of the ebb and flow of the dynamic ice shelf.
Does the whole journey and the breakup and demise of an iceberg of this scale, does it give you any insight into how climate change is going to affect the ice sheet at large in Antarctica?
One event on its own can't tell us that much, but what we're looking at is the regularity of these events. Are they becoming more frequent? And iceberg carving is a big factor in ice loss from Antarctica. So if these iceberg carving events are becoming more frequent, then it's really important factor that we need to be looking at and researching.
While A68 will be remembered as a social media star that was visible from space, scientists will now be turning their attention to the newest chasm on the edge of the vast ice sheet and the next giant berg to set off on its own epic journey. Victoria Gill, BBC News.
See the headlines as they happen and watch BBC News live in the app and get the full story with bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.